Hey, everybody. We'll wait just a few minutes or so to make sure that people actually arrive. I see we have all the speakers. That's always an important first step.
Karen, I like your background. Is it an actual background?
Yeah, it's actually
beautiful.
A little folding screen keeping you from seeing the details of my bedroom. Just
Very,
never
very.
know how ready I'm going to be in the morning. So. Okay. So we have 26 participants, and I want to be sure we have lots of time for interactive conversation. So I'm going to launch right off to start with. So Cecile, were you going to show the goals? I mean the
recommendations?
Yeah. I think what I would do is I'll just read through them to begin with so that people can kind of have them in their mind. I'll make some really brief comments and then I'm going to turn it over to our panel. So welcome everybody who's joined us. I'm just so pleased that people still want to talk about the social determinants of health. But I do want to just keep in mind so that we're sure that we address these at least to some extent. The recommendations from this year of really intense work. Housing, working to make housing an explicit integral element of healthcare and policy and practice. Data sharing and integration, demonstrating and documenting that data can share across sectors and services, something that's of real interest to me. Civil service, collecting data to understand user experiences with the civil justice system. And this is a place where the National Action Agenda group has really kind of gone outside those more standard social determinants that we like to talk about, income, education, and so on. And a really, really important area. Care coordination, which gets into how do we do this kind of work, identifying guidance and support frameworks that outline good and best practices, recognize ROI, which is really an important thing, and includes adaptable and replicable means for cross-sector sharing. Governance, this is an area that I work in a lot. Identify or develop a governance model that enables policy formulation, decision-making processes, and organizational principles. And I think that should probably say, again, across sectors and domains. And then lived experience, making sure that we're always incorporating the people with lived experience at all levels through organizational and governmental programs and systems, not just taking, surveys of their experience, but actually engaging them in the process of providing these services and developing these policies. So with that said, I just want to say good afternoon again to everybody. And I hope you enjoyed the morning session. I certainly did. This breakout session is going to focus more on exploring what's happening in the research space around this very large body called social determinants of health. And I've been asked to take 10 minutes to talk about what we don't know. And so since this is a really expert audience, and since we could spend the entire 2 days talking about what we don't know about social determinants of health, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about what I personally think is really needed in order for us to create something that looks like a coherent strategy for improving health, well-being, and resilience in our communities. I am a dyed-in-the-wool public health practitioner. I have been working within governmental public health for over 25 years. And as such, outside of cocktail party discussions, I tend to be pretty focused on practical. And what I have always wanted to do in my career is do something about the problems that we have. I like talking about them as well, but doing things has been something that I've always been really focused on. And in my most recent work as director of a large state health department, one of the most common dilemmas that I had was a very practical one. And it was basically, how do we get the biggest bang for what little buck we have? And that's one of the main reasons that during my tenure at the California Department of Public Health, I reserved quite a large portion of our very limited unrestricted funding, meaning not siloed funding, and invested it in building an interconnected data ecosystem that could take care of our many previously isolated and topic-specific databases like our 27 different disease registries. I did that because I believe strongly in the power of robust data and information in making good decisions, little decisions, but also really big decisions. And one of our major challenges, as I see it, in effectively addressing the determinants of health is that each of these determinants, whether you're talking about race, income, educational attainment, housing, access to health care, or equity in the justice system, these are not actually discrete things. Each of these determinants reflects an entire system of moving parts. And even more complicated, each of those systems of moving parts are interdependent on each other in many different ways. And the communities in which these social determinants play out have even more dimensions than just those. And our real understanding of these determinants and how they work and what affects them and how they have their effect on health and well-being in the real world has been somewhat limited by the need to look at these determinants in relative isolation. What is the impact of poverty? What is the impact of insecure housing, et cetera? We've been using tools like multiple regression analysis, propensity score analysis, and others to try to understand the graded relationships, because these are not threshold relationships, rather they're graded relationships between and with these determinants. That is a really, it's a start, but it doesn't get us where we need to know to really think about what kinds of interventions we should do. The same issues plague our ability to innovate the full, to evaluate rather, the full impact of interventions that we do put in place. As anyone in public health will tell you, there's no such thing as a placebo-controlled double-blind trial of community health interventions. Communities are way too complex. So how do we figure out what works and what factors may be in play in a given community that could enhance or limit the desired outcome that we have from the interventions we put in place? And how do we fully evaluate the outcomes of these interventions when they have such broad impacts in multiple sectors? And therefore, so that to me is sort of a pivotal question for us. How do we begin to get a handle on understanding how these factors play together, not independently, on communities and on individuals and families? And knowing what works and what works best in what setting and at what cost are not hypothetical questions. If you're Joe Biden, how do you meaningfully address economic disparities? And how do you do it in the panoply of different kinds of communities that we have across even just the United States? And if you do have a plan, how do you evaluate whether that plan is working or not? Now, a lot of harm can come from well-meaning interventions based on assumptions or theories. Anybody remember trickle-down economics? It made some sense in paper. There were a lot of economists who believed in it at the time. But when it became the framework for actual economic policy across the United States, it was one of the strongest drivers of the widening wealth gap in the United States, and all the economic and social ramifications we have seen since that are because of this amazing gap in wealth and this redistribution of money up to the top. So all of those challenges said, I do think there's actually good news. There's a lot we do know, and you're going to hear a lot about what we know and where research is going in this area. We know a lot about the individual social and socioeconomic factors impacting health outcomes, and we're learning more and more about how they interact. In that same way that we now have more and better information, we also have a relatively new tool that is available to us if we know how to use it. I think that machine learning, or so-called artificial intelligence, with its ability to look at incredibly complex systems with many interdependencies and to learn through iteration and then make projections based on that learning. I think this tool has tremendous potential for helping us understand how determinants of health play out in real life. I think AI is a tool that we could potentially use as well to test out interventions and compare outcomes and project perhaps return on investment without necessarily having to put these things in place in real world communities. It's not perfect. There's a lot of promise, but it's only as good as the data that's input, and importantly, the assumptions that are built into the underlying algorithms that AI uses to do the amazing things that it does. And there can be assumptions in those algorithms that we don't even realize we've made. And those assumptions that are tested through machine learning, when put in place in complex ecosystems such as humans, have unintended consequences, as we've seen in the profound impact on the spread of misinformation that was accelerated dramatically by social media algorithms that really were designed with the arguably good intentions of showing you more of what you like when you go on Facebook or YouTube or Google. So, and some of you may actually have read the New York Times article recently about some surprising findings from a Swedish island called Stora Kalso, a famous bird sanctuary. That the pandemic, like everywhere else in the world, pretty much shut down tourist travel to this very popular island. The bird researchers, of course, assumed that this shutdown of tourist traffic with all the disruptions that human caused would be a good thing for the birds. Certainly that's been the case in other wildlife areas where we've seen cool pictures of lions hanging out on tarmac that used to have cars going back and forth. They assumed that the birds would thrive without all of those tourists around. Instead, what they found was a dramatic decrease, almost 25 or 26% in the population of newborn birds. Turns out that without the disruption of all those tourists, eagles that didn't tolerate the humans before came back to the island. And those eagles have a very disruptive effect on the nesting bird population. Just flying over several times a day led to multiple periods of time every day where all of the adult birds leave. They knock their nests off the edge of the cliffs, the eggs get broken, and when they're gone, seagulls and other predators eat their baby birds. So this is a real life example that ecosystems are complex, and even ones that we have been studying for decades as they have these birds, whether they're human or birds, they're difficult to fully understand. And so with that in mind, let's turn to our speakers. You've got their bios, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that, but let's just get right into the conversation. And let's see, gentlemen, which of you is scheduled to go first, PG or I don't actually
believe that I am.
You are, yay!
All right. Well, we're on the same page with so many things. So this is really kind of reiterating some of your comments, Karen, but from my particular perspective. And I'll talk pretty briefly again as well, less than 10 minutes here, so we can make sure and have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So my first point is that information or paying attention to social determinants of health is not new. It's centuries old, from Vermeer to Du Bois to Goldberger. So I don't see this as something that's depressing, but I see this as something that's hopeful, that for many generations, people have realized these are important factors to pay attention to. And there's political ups and downs, scientific ups and downs, where it goes out of favor and comes back into favor. And so I think there's historically reasons to pay attention to social determinants of health. The information is there, the data is there for many generations. And that research base gives a broad direction as to what harms health and what improves health. But along the lines of the sort of more honest, more difficult story is that there's a surprising number of failures and ineffective studies or underperforming studies when we take particular actions based on that information. So that goes back to the first sort of large scale social experiment, New England, the New Jersey negative income tax. And then my advisor, Lisa Berkman, did this as another example, did this amazing study on treating depression and looking at incidence of stroke. And they actually found a lot of people there, like, what could be wrong with that? You think you treat depression. We know depression's a risk factor for worse outcomes with stroke. Actually, a lot of people did worse with that treatment. So we really, my second major point is we should be really, really humble about what we know and the ability to translate from sort of general types of exposures to specific policies. Two other examples from some of the action recommendations, care coordination. What could be wrong with an intensive outpatient program for high need patients? So a colleague of mine, Donna Zolman at the VA here, published a paper at JAMA Internal Medicine in 2017 to evaluate these kind of programs. There's a lot of, in the VA system, a lot of observational data about how beneficial this was for changing utilization patterns, reducing costs. They did a randomized intervention, no impact. Another sort of classic example more on social determinants, improved housing, the moving to opportunity study, large scale social experiment, to give people Section 8 vouchers to move out of high poverty neighborhoods. What ends up, a lot of people didn't want to, and this was, well-meaning, powerful study, really important to evaluate this. A lot of folks didn't want to move, and there were a lot of negative consequences for the kids, especially boys, who moved out of that neighborhood, got out of their social network. So something that was, really thought to be good based on this evidence, when put into practice, did not have the impact that we wanted. So that need to evaluate the specifics, I think, is really key here, and what we've learned from this kind of evidence. Another caution, similar to what Karen was talking about, is when you're dealing with primary prevention, which always sounds very good and very logical, you really have to make sure there's very, very few people, if any, who are harmed by that. Because when you, mathematically speaking, when you do the math on it, and you think about how many people sort of can have benefits, the probability of benefits when you're really addressing something in a large part of the population, you really have to be concerned about any negative sort of impact. So I think one of the promises there, and I'll get to this at my kind of final point, but as we have larger data streams, as Karen has talked about the integration of these data systems, we can have more power to look at potential negative consequences through heterogeneity of treatment effect algorithms. And so HTE, part of machine learning, I put it, as an aspect of that, but, not to worry about the fancy term. It's really just saying, let's look at instead of looking at the average impact of an intervention, let's look at the distributional aspects by sort of priors on domains that we care about, population domains, or just in the full population, and really be able to look using these algorithms at sort of, are 5% of people harmed, 2% of people harmed, 0% of people harmed by that particular intervention. And in a methodological way, there's just been a lot of advances in that area where we can do that pretty well now. My fourth point, we need a lot more feedback between people on the ground and sort of the way that these can be implemented with researchers. if we look at these sort of the national action agenda, these sort of 6 recommendations, there's research on housing, there's research on coordinated care, like I mentioned. There's very little research on the health impacts of civil justice reforms, of data sharing, of governance. Very little is known about that. I mean, again, like all of those things make sense to me. They're very good directions, but getting to Karen's point, what within each of those domains could we have more confidence about the ROI, about how many people would benefit, what the gains would be? And those are just really not part of the research agenda. So as these questions are coming up, and this is, part of the reason why we're so interested in this project, this conversation going forward, those things, there needs to be that feedback between the groups. And the final thing I'll say, which is a bit of a summary of some of this, and again, echoes really, Karen's thinking on this as well, is, the continuous, all of this leads me to believe that kind of the continuous data streams, the real world data, rather than relying on massive social experiments, is, the way forward to understand, where we may be harming, where we may be getting the most benefits. And I think within the research literature, where we're at on causal counterfactual frameworks, either within machine learning or not, we're getting much better at sort of simulating experiments. They're never going to be as good as a true randomized experiment, but I think we're getting to the point where we know enough about when those work and when those don't, to use real data to guide our actions, both in a more cost-effective way, a more real-time way, and a way to evaluate more of all of the little actions that are being taken, rather than relying on these sort of large demonstration experiments. And again, it's not a one or the other, but I think there's so much promise now in moving in that direction, both from the data that's being made available, but also from the methods on the research side. So I hope this is overall a hopeful message about what research can do. There's a long ways to go, that those collaborations can be much better. But I am very positive about, the opportunities we have in front of us here. Thank you.
That was really, and we didn't coordinate on our talks.
Confirming that we did not, but.
PG, you want to go ahead? Are you ready to go? You're on mute. PG, you're on mute. PG, can you, let me see if there's someone else who can help you get off mute.
Who do we want unmuted?
PG?
PG.
I think he's next, just on the speaker.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I sent my slides this morning, but they're not there and I cannot share them, which is very annoying.
There's not, I thought you were a co-host for some reason. So when you click share, nothing comes up.
Can't you make me a co-host?
Yes, it will. I've been talking to the person that can make you a co-host. Give me 1 second. It should take a second. I think you might need
I'm so sorry for that.
No, you might need to actually leave the breakout room and go back into the main session, and then we'll place you back in as a co-host.
Adios, everyone. Have a nice time.
So let's see. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? There's been a little conversation going on in the chat about why FQHCs have not successfully addressed equity, being community-based, community board focused on equity, billions of dollars in investment. And Paul replies, because they've been medicalized. And I do think that, and his other point is revenue. I do think that one of the things we always have to look at when we're thinking about interventions in ways to increase things like equity, social justice, or other sort of high value social changes is what are the ramifications of the way that we fund things? Because just giving a lot of money to something, depending on how it's done, is not necessarily going to answer. And it's very true. It's not just, I think, on FQHCs about how they're funded, but in general, the way that we deliver medicine in the United States, with the amount of time that limitations there are, because the numbers of people that particularly primary care not just doctors, but clinicians have to see one after the other, after the other, after the other, and the complexity of the medical issues that those folks have. Break room closes in 115 seconds. Oh, well, that's a whole lot shorter than I thought. But anyway, it doesn't really allow them time to fully address people's issues, which are very complicated. It doesn't really, and everyone is working, sort of extremely long hours, doesn't really make it possible either for people to really take the time that they need to do to plan carefully how to better increase, for example, the participation of people with lived environment. Which is not to give a total pass, but I also don't think we do a very good job of training healthcare providers in this entire issue and how to actually work on these issues. So I'm not sure what is going on with, am I the only person seeing the breakout room is closing in 62 seconds?
I saw that too. I think they're trying to fix
Yeah, me
it
too.
now.
Okay, they're trying to bring him back. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Not that we don't all have other things to do, but this conversation's been great.
Karen, this is Paul. Can I bring up a
Yes, please.
frame here?
Yeah, great.
It seems to me that really what we need to do is we need to move money out of the medical care system and into the social services. And so I'm interested in how we accomplish that.
Hugely important.
And I want to go back to David's point, because David, if we take money out of medical care, we are going to harm some people. But who are we harming? Right? Are we harming the people who we're providing medical care so that they live 3 more weeks with their cancer? Are we willing to create that harm?
That was the fastest trip from one room to another.
The very definition of cognitive whiplash.
I'd like to
I-
pose a reframe.
Yes, please.
Back to the future.
I think instead of thinking about taking money out of health and putting it into human services, I come at this from a deeply human services background. I really think what we need to do is move human services into health instead of keeping those separated, because the more we maintain the false distinction between biological health and emotional and social well-being and behavioral health, we are perpetuating in our data and in our funding streams a model that is directly contradictory to everything we know about neuroscience.
Really, really excellent point. I, of course, also go to if you really want to do primary prevention, you're not going to work in the world of service delivery at all. Policy and that sort of thing. E.G., were you able to get your slides, or you?
Yeah, but I can show you the slides, but I don't know if the conversation has already started. I don't want it to interrupt, and so.
No, I would love it if you would. I always love your presentation.
You're sure? Yeah, but
entirely selfishly, yes. Please go.
Okay. Listen, I will try to do that fast and not repeat everything. If I can. So what I would like to, those are things I have said it so many times in social exchange meetings already, but the first thing, and it's basically back to what David was telling us, when you look at the story of the language around determinants of health, in the 1960s, when it started to be a real subfield of our discipline, people were concentrating on 4 major determinants. And I think what is important at this moment in research is that we are rediscovering the importance of paying attention to other determinants than only the social and structural determinants, and pay attention to the environment, pay attention to biology. And I will go and try to explain what it means concretely. The other thing we have seen, but I think more recently, is this nuance that exists between social and structural determinants. This was completely absent from the discourse during the 1960s and beyond. This idea that you have social determinants that could be modified by policies, but you have structural determinants that takes much more time to actually change, and that were ignored basically by the literature at the beginning. And of course, the one that is on everybody's mind is racism. A very good example. It's striking when you read the literature of the 60s and 70s how absent this idea is from the literature. I think now I prefer now to use this SDOH when I talk about this, to make sure people are always thinking there's this distinction between social and structural. But I say, like David said, they are constantly revisited because our preoccupation and scientific advances, our preoccupation change, and we also experience scientific advances. The current priorities from a research group, a very important question back from the 50 years of work on this issue is why one individual gets influenced. This is Marmot Farmer's question, why your place in the hierarchy will give you cardiac disease. And we're much better than we were even 15 years ago to explain how this works. I will insist on IT and data, and the questions of how do we build funding and financing, how do we use the marginal dollar to have the maximum impact on social and structural determinants. And finally, a question that I have discussed numerous times with Karen and David, what are the best strategies to move this agenda forward? I always also go back to this to remind ourselves that this is not new. Again, David mentioned that this is a screenshot from the Beveridge Report of 1942, which is the Magna Carta of the welfare state, or the Declaration of Independence of Social Policy. And you will see that housing and health and education, and in the curious language of the time, but Beveridge was already thinking that way, with complete integration of those factors in the perspective that he was suggesting. It's an error to believe that this is new. This is something that has been around. And in a way, it's also an invitation to be very careful, because it means that knowing that for so long, how it is that we have made so little progress is a very important question, in a way, a lesson in humility. And this is something I have shown to Karen recently. This is work based on work I did at Hopkins years ago. I suggest we start by the right-hand side of that slide. I won't go into the details, of course, but in a way, the holy grail of what we're trying to do, especially from a data perspective, is decided that at some point we will be able to provide care, provide services, in which we will have information that will have integrated everything we know about the determinants that are affecting, impacting the client, the patient, the family of the patient or the client. And we have discovered as well, I would say in the same period, that this is not enough. I remember a very interesting natural experiment where they provide that kind of information to physicians that discovered that because they have no way of changing the housing conditions of their patient, they were in a situation of immense frustration. And the only way you could overcome that frustration is that you build at the same time a community action, a policy agenda, a community agenda that gives you the possibility of designing intervention that will also play on, if Mrs. Smith has an issue because of an housing problem, you need to be able to solve the housing problem. Even if you have all the information of the world, you won't be able to solve a problem if you don't have a venue for political and community action. And this is essential. So this is the work my colleagues at Hopkins have continued to do during that, since I left Hopkins 5 years ago. On the other side, on the left-hand side, this is how we see the big pot of data that exists about the determinants at this moment. And you will see tomorrow in the presentation from Susan Tamang from Stanford, the enormous progress that has been made here at Stanford around the problem of integrating those data that are very different in the way they are collected, in the way they are structured, even in the chronicity of those different data sets. And enormous progress has been made in that sense, because again, the holy grail is also to be able to integrate data that are so different in nature. The thing that I think we tend to neglect, and I will end on this, is what we have called the time drivers. And it's all those elements that are actually amplifying the effect and the impact of the determinants. And in fact, you know, this is something, again, people in public health will be very familiar with those questions, that we are conscious that we need more and more and more and more research to understand exactly those amplification effects, and the way, on the opposite, some of those drivers are filtering the positive impact of some of the determinants. And so being able to understand that, for me, is one of the very important frontier in the, let's call that the social sciences of the determinants, which is a very important area. I have other colleagues working on the data. I have other colleagues working on the biology of the determinants, and I need their work. But in the end, I think there is an agenda for social scientists in that area to look at those drivers. And for the rest, I will just repeat what Karen and David have told you brilliantly in their own interventions. Thank you.
Thanks, PG, and I concur. I'm actually fascinated by the social sciences, and having just come up through the sort of so-called hard sciences, which is derogatory, but we are blinded often about research techniques that and how to look at information slightly distinct from data in a way that is actually rigorous. We have a tendency to dismiss anything that isn't numerical. If you grow up in the biological or chemical sciences, et cetera. So I just want to say thank you for that. I'm going to call on Denise just because she's had her hand up for some time. Denise, would you like to ask a question, and then we just sort of open it up more broadly, or make a statement?
Thanks. Yeah, I have a comment. I'm new to this National Action Agenda group, but I came across, there's a woman, she's from Nigeria, and I don't know her name, but she wrote a book called Target Africa, and she's critiquing foreign aid to Africa, and she uses the term ideological colonialism. So I think her thinking is interesting and relevant, because she says, for example, in foreign aid, she says that Canada comes up with a program and then they go to Africa with the program, and the program's already thought up in Canada, and the funding's already allocated according to the program that was designed in Canada. And so her point is, and I think this can apply to communities of color, or disenfranchised communities, or people with criminal justice background, people experiencing homelessness. I think that with all of our great minds, at the same time, I think having that cultural humility that someone mentioned earlier, of before we decide what we want to research and what we want to fund and what we should do, how about going to the communities that are actually the communities that will be the recipients of this program, and finding ways, like we said, the social sciences of social determinants, finding socially effective ways, because there's power differentials if we're not from the community. And all of that has to be completely transparent. It has to be on the table. And then the people in the community get to inform us of what they need and what's not working. And then we start from there. And then we can add in the biology and the epigenetics and all of our knowledge. But I feel that should come second to actually going to the communities and hearing from them what they need.
Absolutely. And that's at the heart of the work that's done in, for example, accountable communities for health type interventions, where you have multi-sector collaboratives that come together, but they very explicitly have not just input from the community, but leadership by community members. And that, I think that's one of the reasons that you'll see that on the slides that Daniel had earlier today, that very clearly draw out at every stage. We have to consider the people that were actually, that have lived experience in these various communities. And welcome to the conversation, Denise. I hope you stick around for the next year's work.
Thank you.
Anyone else have
I'd follow up on Denise. This is Charlie Bruner, and I thought of as you were talking, Denise, the joke, why did it take 3 Boy Scouts to help the little old lady across the street? And the answer is because she didn't want to go. And I do think that we have a wealth of information, research, and science that says that we do better with people when they are engaged in their planning and they feel invested. And if we're going to talk about compliance with regimens, it's an understanding, and it's establishing relationships of trust. And I don't think we want to minimize the fact that we have a tremendous research base, that we do much better with interventions when we're doing them with people and not to people. And I personally feel, I mentioned in the chat box, around the notion of accompaniment and the community health worker approach of reducing the distance between the culture of the community and the culture in the professions, that I do think we have a good body of research and knowledge around exemplary practices that when you develop relationships of trust with families, when you listen to and value what they say, and when they are partners in developing their own plans, there is much more follow through and the results are much better. That really is less program than it is the attributes of practice within a setting, and the actual facts that is going on in a practice.
Thank you for that. Daniel, is this better? Daniel told me I was a little bit quiet, so I'm switching yeah, okay, good, thank you. Okay, anyone else? I'm looking through the chat, which is absolutely fascinating and I hope is being kept somewhere. Or other topics anyone wants to bring up, follow up on what has already been said, or something entirely new.
Can I comment on trust, or I don't
Please.
want to monopolize?
No, not at all.
Okay. Go ahead. So, coming from a trauma perspective, trust isn't something, I don't think, that can be quantified through an algorithm or through artificial intelligence. I think trust has a physiological impact. It slows down our heart rate, it opens our heart, it calms us down. And trust in itself is a factor that can contribute to health outcomes. So it's not strictly about the measurable, quantifiable outcome that we are looking at. It's actually about the establishment of trust itself as a goal, I would say. So that's another piece of what Charles was saying, that nothing's going to work, in my opinion, without trust. And trust doesn't fit in the timeframes. It doesn't fit into what I think should happen when, and what amount of adherence to this recommendation should occur. It's totally decentralized, and it's based on the the person's subjective progress in their own experience.
So I have to second that. I think that's an incredibly important issue, and one reason why it's such a good idea if you are going to go in and work in a community and you want to engage the community, you also have to work very closely with the already trusted partners in the community, and those folks can help. You need to establish trust with them first. And also I would just say that working across sectors, the whole issue of bringing data together, et cetera, the biggest barriers that we encountered, and we have the expert on this in this, Mike Wilkening, used to be the Secretary for Health and Human Services and was the sort of leader, visionary and motivator of our work trying to bring together data systems from across just one agency. A lot of it was just a trust issue. This is my data. I can't trust you not to do the wrong thing with it, not to share it inappropriately, et cetera. And so I think that you're right. And the speed at which we always feel like we must work gets in the way of doing these really basic things that can make relationships both more productive, but also longer lasting. So, go ahead. Please, yes, please.
One thing, I certainly hear your Peace Corps experience in your comments, and I share those. But the other thing is that, and sort of you go into these conversations about trust, but then when you need to do these things, you need to do it at scale. And that's a push-pull kind of thing, right? I mean, how do you do these things at such a, I mean, it only makes sense to do it at scale.
I think that's true for some especially high-level policy interventions, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily true that you have to scale every intervention to a really high level, or at least what you do have to do is build a framework that can be individualized to individual communities. So you can fit it into that community. And that is not something we're good at. We're really good at saying, you must do exactly these things. Here are your 12 deliverables. They have to be delivered in exactly this way. I call it the tyranny of the best practice. For those of us who work in clinical medicine, evidence-based practices are gold standard because they've been tested in people, and everything that you could possibly control for that they know of, it's controlled for. You can't do that in communities. And as a consequence, you simply can't make a control that works. We've tried. I tried that in Nepal for some education interventions, communities that were really very far apart. But if something works, it spreads, whether you want it to or not. So your control is inevitably being contaminated by your interventions. But so anybody else want to? Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation? Oh, no, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Charlie. I'd like to add a little
Charlie.
bit. I mean, I think back not as far back as 1942, but Lisbeth Shore's Within Our Reach, breaking the cycles of disadvantage and looking at exemplary programs and practices that really did have pretty remarkable impacts upon in families and with communities that a lot of people felt nothing is working on showing this. And she really looked at what are the attributes of those programs and practices. And it was really a consistent, relentless kind of problem solving, engaging, reaching out to and working with families in terms of an asset-based approach where there were expectations of values that did produce the results. We don't usually certainly in randomized controlled trials, we try to identify or isolate the intervention into a kind of a specific drug, treatment, modality, or whatever, and not into this longer term kind of, are you operating according to these attributes? And I would say that as far as going to scale, there are two things. One is to try to have more systems which operate according to these attributes, and to really place them there and really do them. And two is really to have a concerted focus on how you create that as the method of practice within the organization. And usually it has to be top to bottom, and particularly since most of the work with families is under the front line, those people cannot be regarded as the least expert and the least important people and the most interchangeable people in the system and not really mattering and really having the people above. They really are the eyes and the ears and the heart of the intervention. So I think scaling, when you talk about scaling attributes, I think it really is taking that systemic focus, and it's not so much about individual specific programmatic thrusts. And I think we also have to recognize that, you know, some of those wonderful programs that Lee presented, you know, they were not at scale in their communities. Their communities, they were serving maybe 5% of the population or whatever. And if we're going to achieve success, they have to be, and if we're going to look at something on a population-based level, they have to be in preponderance enough to make a difference. And last point, you know, I mean, when George Bush talked about 1,000 points of light, I mean, I think really was saying this is what makes for a strong community where people grow up healthy. Well, I think it's not 1,000, it's probably 1,000,000 points of light, but we have to really look at, are we getting to a level within a community where we have enough of these institutions and supports and exemplary practices that there really does create that sense of trust and hope and belief that we're moving forward. If they're just, you know, kind of always very small and fighting against the dominant thrust in a community, it's hard to have them be, to demonstrate community-wide impacts.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think one thing I just want to call out, it's a minor issue, but I think it's something we don't do enough, and that is asset-based assessments and conversations. It's just like asset-based community development as well, rather than starting with what's wrong here. Actually, Nancy made a really good comment in the chat. Nancy, would you like to just kind of in the last couple of minutes tell the whole group about that a little bit more? The lack of local discretion.
So, I mean, just as a little context, so I do work at a FQHC, and one of the people on my group brought up who was working with kids, you know, there was a particular community, and one of the strong goals of that community was to keep children in foster care as sibling groups together. And she brought up a particular incident where there was one family where there was one of the elder siblings was doing very well, not with their other siblings. And the system forced that child into a setting that wasn't as good for him to be with siblings. And the social worker and the parents, everyone was very well aware that that wasn't going to be best for that child. And yet the goals of the program were to keep the siblings together. Just a small example of where giving that social worker more discretion to say, hey, we need to make an exemption in this case. And there's many situations, you know, that's just a single one in the foster care system where if you make your goals too broad and too specific and don't take into consideration the local dynamic or don't give discretionary authority to the people who know people, then you can make the same case that judges don't have adequate discretionary authority with their mandatory sentencing, that kind of thing. But we need to give trust back to the people who are working on the ground, who are working with people with lived experience, that was just the point I was making. We need broad goals, but we need discretion on the floor.
Excellent point. Really incredibly important to keep in mind as we work with more and diverse, whether it's individuals, whether it's families, whether it's whole communities. They're unique into themselves. Okay, I think we're getting close to end. Anybody have a final point they want to bring out about anything that we said, or bring up something entirely new just to frustrate everyone when the conversation gets cut off in the middle? Always my fave. PG or David, do you have any last comments you'd like to make? Not seeing anybody reaching for the mute. Well, thank you all so much. I personally have really enjoyed this conversation. I think that we've touched on some really important things to keep in mind, both from the research end but then all the way into the implementation of how we actually try to understand, not do harm as we're trying to do good. And so I think we should be going to the main room pretty darn quick automatically, whether you like it or not. And so let's see, let's take Dimple's last. I think this is a really good, it's really easy to get caught up in data, but changing behavior relies more often on emotional rather than rational data. So we need to ensure that the emotional rationale aligns with the priorities of the communities. Excellent point. We are all emotional beings. And so much of how we experience the world and how we act in it is based in emotion. So you might have a couple-minute break here if you want to turn off your cameras, and we'll see you all back. Thank you all so much for a really great breakout session.